Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's edition of the Seekers Forum. I hope you're having a great weekend. And let's say hi to Jay Cogley. How are you, Jay?
Hello, Mark. I'm doing good. Good to see you.
Good, nice to see you too. So, we are looking this month at truth and consequences and the costs of deception, the high price that we pay for avoiding the essential truths of our lives. At a time like ours, when immorality in the public sphere is everywhere and alternative facts are increasingly permissible, it would be tempting to use this talk to focus on the truth and consequences of the external world, on social and political lies, on the decline of public ethics, and the increase of media manipulation that characterize the time we're living in. But since our purpose in the Seekers Forum is awakening and knowing ourselves spiritually as souls moving towards self-realization, I'm not going to focus on cultural psychology and the social harms of deception, but rather on the cost that we pay for avoiding the truth of who we are as spiritual beings, and how the opportunity to know ourselves diminishes when we waste that opportunity, how it diminishes our day-to-day lives. Now, the purpose of philosophy, as everyone in the Seekers Forum knows, is self-realization, meaning the realization of our own true nature. The word philosophy stems from the Greek for love of wisdom, and this love is what drives every seeker's journey. The urgent desire to become wiser, to move from ignorance toward self-knowledge, from darkness toward light, and from bondage toward freedom. When Jesus promises his disciples in John 8:31 that if they abide in his word, they will know the truth and that the truth will set them free. When he said that, he was articulating the central claim of masters and sages across traditions since the dawn of time, and that is simply this: that when we discover the perennial truth of our nature, and we recognize ourselves as children of God, however we define divinity, we free ourselves of egotistical shackles and we step toward our own essential nature. Recognizing this primordial truth, we are liberated from the lie of the mind that keeps us imprisoned in a false and diminished sense of self. This recognition also enables us to see the consequences of our own self-deception in a new way, and how we're oppressed by our own ignorance. It sensitizes us to the actual destructiveness of this lie and the calamities that it causes in the world around us. As Emerson wrote, "The reason why the world lacks unity and lies broken and in heaps is because man is disunited in himself." And that is how we create such a chaos, such a mess of this beautiful world. Avoiding the fact of our unity and agreeing to see ourselves as fragments of the whole rather than microcosms of the one that is always there, we live, as Emerson put it, in parts and particles, like trees that forget their parts of a forest, forever rooted and branched within the earth. But we can wake up from this case of mistaken identity, and that's the important point. There's an Indian parable that illustrates this movement very well. In this story, a group of tigers leaves one of their cubs behind in a forest by mistake. This cub is found by a flock of sheep who take the tiger cub in as one of their own. They teach the orphan tiger to bleat like a sheep and walk like a sheep and eat grass like any good sheep would. Well, time passes, and then one day, an adult tiger happens to wander by in the forest and sees this ridiculous sight of this half-grown tiger prancing around as if it were an overgrown lamb. The adult tiger takes the youth by the scruff of his neck and leads her in the direction of the pond, where the young tiger is able to see her own reflection in the water for the first time. The young tiger is amazed to see what she really is. The older tiger teaches her that it's time to begin using her authentic voice. At first, all she can do is bleat like a sheep, but gradually, as the young tiger practices, she feels a powerful new sound beginning to emerge in the back of her throat. She experiments with this voice again and again, building her confidence, until finally the young tiger opens her mouth and lets out the great roar of freedom. That is how all of us live. We live like orphaned tiger cubs that have been raised by sheep, until we look in the mirror and acknowledge the truth of who we are. On the seeker's path, for all of us, there comes a definitive, defining moment when you're forced to admit that you're not a minuscule personality. You're not just an identity trapped in a false narrative formed from how your body looks, how much money you have, what people think of you, your biases, beliefs, and memories. You're not this self-absorbed ego limited by learned blindness, performing to prove its own self-worth, forever lacking and never satisfied. Instead, you see, when you look closely enough, that you're the thing that's looking through your eyes. You're the awareness that's bigger than your body-mind, the thing in you that has never changed, which doesn't age and does not die. Stepping beyond the story of the little me, even for a moment, gives you a glimpse of a new way of living. You see, as I like to say, that you're the storyteller, not the story. You've mistaken yourself for a figure in your mind until now, instead of being able to see through that mask. This unmasking of the truth is critical for all of us, but for seekers, it's actually felt as truly urgent. We're too hungry for reality, for knowing what we truly are and getting free of our sufferings to be satisfied with an unexamined life. Seekers are people who recognize that at the end of the day, very little else matters, save how well we've loved and been loved. We sense that if we don't stop deceiving ourselves and others and pretending to be smaller and less transcendent than we are, that we may very well be wasting our lives. Our deepest desire is to be unconditionally happy, like everyone else. And what seekers come to realize after years of futile struggle is that the ego is incapable of happiness. The ego is incapable of happiness. It's too attached to appearances, possessions, achievements, and myriad other things that simply cannot last. You could say that the primary difference between seekers and other folks, or people who are on a path of awakening and people who aren't, is this urgent recognition that self-knowledge and the wisdom that comes from it is the central purpose of our existence. Aldous Huxley put it this way, quote, "The saint is one who knows that every moment of our human life is a moment of crisis. For at every moment, we are called upon to make an all-important decision, to choose between the way that leads to death and spiritual darkness and the way that leads toward light and life." You really can't say it more plainly than that. Either we live in ignorance, lie to ourselves, and avoid the truth of our spiritual nature, what Thoreau called quiet desperation, or we make the choice toward awakening. All it takes is the decision not to live in ignorance to catalyze this spiritual insight and awakening. Huxley put it this way, quote, "It is because we don't know who we are, because we are unaware that the kingdom of heaven is within us, that we behave in the generally silly, the often insane, the sometimes criminal ways that are so characteristically human. But when we come to recognize our authentic nature, that changes." He says, "We are saved, we are liberated and enlightened by perceiving the hitherto unperceived good that is already within us, returning to our eternal ground, where, without knowing it, we have always been." Isn't that beautiful? Let me just repeat that. We are saved, we are liberated and enlightened by perceiving the hitherto unperceived good that is already within us, returning to our eternal ground, where, without knowing it, we have always been. Now, this may sound obvious, but actually the practice of remaining with this kind of awareness is extremely arduous from moment to moment, as most everyone knows. There are times, especially at the beginning of a spiritual journey, when we ask ourselves how we can possibly hope to cross the abyss that seems to exist between the ordinary self-absorbed lives that we live and the enlightened state that Huxley and others talk about. It can be tempting to just throw up our hands and give up, to say enough of this aspiration to awaken and just go back to our mistaken identity. But in fact, this going back, this reversion, is much harder than it seems once you've had a glimpse of freedom and happiness and spiritual beauty. Once you've been bitten by the serpent of wisdom, the venom of longing is in your veins. The venom that will eventually kill your ignorant self and help you slip out of that old skin into awareness of your spiritual being. Now, this bite of wisdom, of the serpent of wisdom, can come in many different ways, from a moment of philosophical clarity, or meeting a remarkable teacher, having an experience of awe, being broken open either by love or by grief. Anything that awakens in you the hunger for truth will do the trick. This desire, as most everyone on this call knows, is hard to quell once it's been stirred. It's a bit like having your thirst quenched by clear, sweet water for the first time after drinking from years from a tainted source. So the question is, how do we hone to this truth in our lives and refuse the temptation to live lives of self-deception? I've put together a few reminders and practices that have helped me a lot over the years that I'd like to share with you. The first is to recognize and question your mistaken identity. The first step on any bona fide spiritual journey is to become aware of the pervasive lie of the mind that convinces us that our egotistical identity is who or what we actually are. We all need to make that connection. In the Seekers Forum, we use self-inquiry to facilitate this shift, asking the question, who am I? That's what we do in the guided writing practice that we share together, for example. There are lots of different ways to prompt this insight of recognizing and questioning your mistaken identity, from writing to meditation to koan practice. It doesn't matter. Whatever reveals this felt sense of difference between the observer and the observed, the witness and the movements of the body-mind will work just fine. The second thing to remember and to use is how important it is to establish yourself in a bona fide practice that supports this self-recognition. And the operative word here is establish. Because without regularity, intention, curiosity, and space for self-care, it's very hard, if not impossible, to lay the foundations of awakening. The thing is, we can't expect perfection. The point is not that we are moving quickly toward mastery. What matters is that we keep showing up in whatever practice keeps self-awareness awake in us, this spiritual perspective. Also, notice your resistance and how the mind avoids even positive things that feel imposed upon it. And also, the ever-present necessity to forgive yourself for your lapses and your forgettings, to give yourself a figurative pat on the back when you fail, when you forget, when you give up, and simply move back to your practice as quickly as you can. The next point is to nourish your hunger for the truth through all means available to you. This is very important because, of course, practice doesn't end on your cushion or your yoga mat. Your life is the source of your deepest practice in all of its weirdnesses and inconsistencies, disappointments, pain, as well as love. In fact, the world is your teacher. So learn from every moment and try to strengthen the awareness of what is real and what is not on a consistent basis. For example, know the difference between names and things, between thoughts and lived experience. Don't be fooled into believing that thinking about a person is the same as being with a person, for example, or that thinking about yourself has anything to do with being yourself as you are, without the interference of falsifying thoughts. So whatever it is that nourishes your hunger for the truth and ratifies and proves the fact that you are not this limited ego-bound personality is going to be a grist for the mill of awakening. The next point is to surround yourself with people who inspire you, who share your aspiration and support your practice. This also is critical. We need connection by whatever means with others who share our hunger for the truth. We need the mirror of other people's lives to fully witness our own, since we're never separate and we're never alone, if we avail ourselves of other people. When we make mistakes or we fall down or we can't make sense of where we are, it's essential to have people around us who've been there themselves and understand the phase that we're in. Luckily, today we have so many ways to connect with other seekers, with great teachers, in places like YouTube, places like the Seekers Forum. So take advantage of them. What I have found for many years is that 5 minutes spent listening to a wise podcast can keep your channels open. It can change the rest of your day. The next point is to stop feeding the self-absorbed, fear-ridden ego that keeps you addicted to illusion. Now, that's a tall order. That's a lot harder than it sounds. But without changing behaviors that feed the beast, we only make self-deception worse. Social media is the first obvious culprit today because it magnifies insecurities, comparisons, fear, as well as solipsistic, self-absorbed thinking. Lots of people are changing their media intake habits precisely to protect themselves and to practice a kind of personal psychological hygiene. So ask yourself, what do you do on a regular basis to make things worse for your mind? Whether it's watching too much TV or drinking too much or smoking too much or distracting yourself too much or thinking too much about yourself, especially in relation to others. It's important to recognize what those behaviors are and to begin to pull back, to start making agreements with yourself. And this is another area where knowing other seekers is enormously helpful when it comes to accountability and also for sharing the feelings that are bound to come up as we break these addictions to self-absorption. The next point is to remember the urgency of awakening. This is what Huxley was talking about when he called every moment a moment of crisis. Now, of course, we don't want to live in crisis. I think Huxley chose the wrong word. But it is important not to become too lax about spiritual awakening either. The time is now, life is short, and nothing else matters at the end of the day but self-realization. Everything else falls away from us as we age except wisdom. It's the only thing that we can increase, and we fail to do that at our own peril. Because all of us, when we're on our deathbeds, will want to have cultivated as much equanimity and discernment and self-awareness as possible when we have the time. So once again, it's important for all of us as seekers to remember that the time to do this is now. Next, question the values and the messages of society and how they serve as obstacles. And once again, social media plays a big part in this. We're inundated with opinions and information and memes and toxic social messages every time we turn on our computer or the evening news. We swim in a river of biases and special interests that color how we live in ways that we're probably not aware of. It's extremely important to question these messages, especially how we absorb and repeat them without thinking and thus become part of the problem. Egos feeding false information to other egos, forgetting the truth of why we're here. That is a simple definition of the material world, and it's vital for us to be aware of this as we move from deception toward truth. Next, be as honest with yourself as possible about what hurts and where authentic happiness actually comes from. When you realize that the ego can never be happy, you see how this correlates with general pain and unhappiness in your life, much of which arises from attempts to placate and soothe the wounded ego. Efforts made to heal ego wounds by way of egotistical gratification are bound to fail. Let me repeat that. Efforts made to heal ego wounds by way of egotistical gratification are bound to fail. It seems so obvious, but we do it all the time. The truth is that the disease can't be the doctor. So notice when you're engaged in activities whose results can never make you happy. Notice how you actually feel when you're trying to put out fire with fire, to switch metaphors. You feel burned. You feel burnt out. Becoming aware of what hurts and what doesn't is a major step toward self-realization and equanimity. It sounds easier than it is, but it truly is essential. The next point is to question your fear of change, loss, and emptiness. Question your fear of change, loss, and emptiness. The ego fears emptiness more than anything else because it itself is already empty and struggles desperately to cover this up. The ego's entire project is to appear full and robust and unbreakable and unshakable. It fights against its own dismantling. And that is why we fear change and loss, and also why we fight against the truth of impermanence. We erect monuments to ourselves in the world that simply cannot last. The ego's efforts at immortality lead to the deception that we're talking about, and also why the denial of death is such an issue in our culture. We deny our human condition, and we spend our lives dancing around the truth at great cost to our happiness. Next, experiment with feeling free. Experiment with feeling free. Seek out experiences that engender a sense of possibility, imagination, enlargement, courage, insight, opening. As seekers, our hunger for truth is born from a thirst for freedom, to be liberated from the straitjacket of a false sense of self. So experiment with things that prompt feelings of uplift, expansion, transformation, overcoming limitations and transcending your sense of imprisonment. That can mean taking an afternoon off for yourself, or a hike or a picnic, attending a lecture, or it can mean taking a break from online dating, obsessing about success and relationships, and simply riding the waves of your life for a while, not struggling quite so hard. Whatever causes the ego to unclench its grip on trying to make things happen and fighting the current of how things are can move you toward your own freedom. And finally, ask yourself in any given moment, what would love do? What does love want of me now? This is a thought experiment that I use a lot, and it rarely fails. When you're faced with a choice or how to respond, ask yourself very simply, what does love want? You'll be amazed at how clearly you see the truth. Your ego may wrestle with what you see, but you can't make love or the truth go away. You can bury them, you can argue with them, you can delay them indefinitely. But there is a thing in you that knows the truth. Call it the heart mind, call it the witness, and you can defer to it whenever you want. In this moment of deferring to the witness, you embody your own higher nature, the nature of that tiger in the woods had forgotten when it was still pretending to be a sheep. So love, or call it God if you like, knows what to do at every moment. Just don't believe me, but try this for yourself. The next time you're in a serious quandary, ask yourself, what would love or God have me do? And take that action. That's how we begin to practice living as the awakening beings that we actually are. So that's what I wanted to say to you today about truth and consequences. And now we're going to do a little bit of writing. Jay, would you please pull up the prompt? Here we go. I'd like you now, please, to take 20 minutes to consider a conundrum in your current life and ask yourself, what would love do? What would love do? Be as specific as you can be, please. We'll take 20 minutes to do that. 10 minutes in, Jay will open up the breakout rooms if you would like to connect with other folks. Otherwise, just keep on writing. 20 minutes, please.